I want to welcome you all to the regular sponsorship workshop here at the Pompano Beach group of Alcoholics Anonymous. My name is Jim and I'm an alcoholic. Hi everybody, glad you're here. Today we're going to be taking a look at how to teach the 11th step. And we will conduct this meeting as a regular AA meeting, but we do shorten it up a little bit in the interest of saving time. And this meeting is an hour and a half, and we take a 10-minute break at the midway point. So please join me in a moment of silent meditation, and we'll say the Serenity Prayer together. Thank you, Serenity Prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. And Alcoholics Anonymous is a fellowship of men and women who share their experience, strength, and hope with each other, and may solve their common problem and help others recover from alcoholism. The only requirement for membership is a desire to stop drinking. There are no dues or fees for a membership. We are self-supporting to our own contributions. And AA is not allied with any sect, denomination, politics, organization, or institution. Not wish to engage in any controversy, neither endorses nor opposes any causes. Our primary purpose is to stay sober, help other alcoholics to achieve sobriety. And Tom's going to read how it works for us.
Tom, an alcoholic. Rarely have we seen a person fail who has certainly followed our path. Those who do not recover, people who cannot or will not completely give themselves to this simple program. Usually men and women who are constitutionally incapable of being honest with themselves. There are such unfortunates, they're not at fault. They seem to have been born that way. They're naturally incapable of grasping and developing a manner of living. Which demands rigorous honesty. But chances are less than average. There are those too who suffer from grave emotional mental disorders, but many of them do recover if they have the capacity to be honest. Our stories disclose in a general way what we used to be like, what happened, and what we're like now. You decide you want what we have and are willing to go to any length to get it, then you're ready to take certain steps. And some of these we balked. We thought we could find an easier, softer way, but we could not. With all the earnestness of our command, we beg of you to be fearless and thorough from the very start. Some of us try to hold on to old ideas, and the result was known to let go absolutely. Remember that we deal with alcohol, cunning, baffling, and powerful. Without help, it is too much for us. There is one who has all power, that one is God. May you find him now. Half measures availed us nothing. We stood at the turning point. We asked for protection and care with complete abandon. Here are the steps we took, which are suggested as a program recovery. 1, we admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that lives had become unmanageable. 2, came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. 3, made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood Him. 4, made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. 5, admitted to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. 6, we're entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. 7, humbly ask Him to remove our shortcomings. 8, made a list of all persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. 9, made direct amends to such people wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. 10, continue to take personal inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly admitted it. 11, sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood Him, praying only for the knowledge of His will for us and the power to carry that out. Step 12, having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, we tried to carry this message to alcoholics and practice these principles in all our affairs. Many of us exclaim, "What an order, I can't go through with it." Do not be discouraged. No one among us has been able to maintain anything like perfect adherence to these principles. We're not saints. The point is that we're willing to grow along spiritual lines. The principles we have set down are guides to progress. We claim spiritual progress rather than spiritual perfection. Our description of the alcoholic, the chapter to the agnostic, and our personal adventures before and after make clear 3 pertinent ideas. A, that we were alcoholic and could not manage our own lives. B, that probably no human power could relieve our alcoholism. And C, that God could and will for yourself.
Good. Thank you, Tom. Okay. Let's take a look at step 11. It begins at the bottom of page 85 and continues on 86, 87, and 88. Before we get started with the 11th step in itself, it's important for us when we're working with sponsees to teach them where this comes from and what the purpose of this 11th step is and how it fits into the scheme of the 12 steps. If we remember back in the third step, let's turn back to page 63 so that we are on the same page here. In the third step, the discussion of the third step, we have at the top of page 63 a paragraph which tells us where we are going. It is, in effect, a first statement of the promises which we find later in the after the 9th step. They're different language, but the same promises. But right at the beginning of this paragraph, it tells us this in the second line: we had a new employer, being all-powerful. He provided what we needed if we kept close to him and performed his work well. Now, one of the things that we need to do is we need to teach our sponsees to parse these sentences so that it isn't just a matter of glossing over it and saying, oh, yeah, I understand that. Let's look to see what it actually says. That God is all-powerful. And there's no equivocation there. It doesn't say that we reserve some power to ourselves, but we're looking at an all-powerful being here. However we choose to describe or call this all-powerful being. And he will provide what we need. Now, the word what means everything. Doesn't mean some of the stuff we need, but all that we need. He will provide. But there are two things that we must do. One is that we must stay close to God, and the other is that we must perform his work well. So, at this stage, at the third step, we are not close to God. We are blocked from him by our guilt and remorse and shame and our insanities and our defects of character. And so this is telling us that at some point, when we have achieved a closeness to our Creator, from there on it will be necessary for us to stay close and also to perform his work well. And this last phrase is repeated in many different ways throughout the Big Book. Now, staying close to God. Let's go back to page 85 now and see what's happened here. We've worked the first 9 steps. We've reached the 10th step. And the last full paragraph on page 85 tells us this: that much has already been said about receiving strength, inspiration, and direction from him who has all knowledge and power. Notice that these are gifts. This is something that God gives us. He gives us strength, gives us inspiration, and direction. And another thing about that sentence which is so important to understand is that whenever we get into a discussion in the rooms here about humility, you might remember what this sentence says, that God has all knowledge and power. If we accept that as being true, what's left for us to feel prideful or egotistical about? Whatever power we may have will be as a derivative and a gift from God. Just as it says here, receiving strength, inspiration, and direction from God. In other words, what we get from him is a gift. And therefore, for us to ascribe any power to ourselves is not only is it incorrect, but it means that we haven't learned our lesson yet. Going on, it tells us this: if we have carefully followed directions. Please notice the word directions. It doesn't say a thing here about if we have oh so nicely and maybe just golly gee whiz we've sort of followed the suggestions. It doesn't say anything about suggestions here. It talks about directions. And this is the 4th place in the Big Book where what we are shown to do are called directions. And so if we've carefully followed directions, and that doesn't mean the directions coming down to us from some treatment center, or from Joe and Charlie, or from Hazelton, or from our local neighborhood on the corner psychiatrist. This means the directions here in the big book. If we have carefully followed directions, we have begun to sense the flow of His Spirit into us. Now, this is just exactly what we were promised back in the 4th chapter was going to happen. That we're going to find God deep down within us. And that this is the only place He could be found. And so we have begun to sense the flow. We're feeling the flow. We have established a God buzz, which we get from time to time. We just know. We sense. Does not mean that there's anything here that there's a meter on it that we can point to meter and say, see, it's up to 25 now. This is something that's within us. But we sense the flow of God's Spirit into us. And that's a wonderful day when we begin to feel that. And then, to some extent, we have become God conscious. Now this is a very, very, very important milestone in our spiritual development, isn't it? You see, being God conscious means that we have now gotten close to God. You see how this all works? As we work the steps, we work our way from rebellion and defiance and denial to a place of surrender, where we become conscious of God. We become conscious of His power and Spirit within us. And so we have drawn close to Him. On page 84, it tells us that we have entered the world of the Spirit. It's in the second full paragraph, right in the middle of the page. We have entered the world of the Spirit. So you can see that when we started with this whole thing back in the 3rd step, what we were being told is, you're going to have to get close to God, but then it's going to be necessary to stay close to Him and to perform His work well. And if you do so, then God will give you everything you need. Now you may have some people are in these rooms and have severe doubts about whether the big book is true or false. And there isn't any way for anyone to prove the truth or the falsity of it except to point to the record. With millions of people who have recovered, one would have to say there's got to be something to this. And I've been asking people for all the time I've been around, show me a lie in the big book, and nobody's been able to do it yet. There may be some in there, but I haven't found them. And so we've become God conscious. We have become conscious of the God within. This is not something that will be displayed in bright lights and neon. It's not something that we can look at in widescreen Technicolor, stereo, and Dolby. It's within us. It's a sense. It's a feeling. It's a knowledge that this has happened. And furthermore, to even illustrate further how close we've drawn to God, we have begun to develop this vital sixth sense, which means that now, because we have been freed from the things which block us from God, the defects, the insanities, and the guilts, we are now in a place where we can be inspired by Him, where we can be conscious of intuitive thoughts which we will receive. And it tells us this in the 11th step, that this is what's going to happen. So now we're at this threshold, aren't we, where we have been, as a result of working the steps, we have automatically been granted release from those things in ourselves which block us from God, and we have been granted the inflow of His Spirit into us, and we have become God conscious, and we've been granted a sixth sense, a tie-in, some kind of a connection with God. So when we read that little sentence in the 3rd step, it becomes clear now what we must do, doesn't it? That once we have achieved this nearness, this closeness to God, now we must maintain it. We must stay close to Him. And we must perform His work well. Now the tools which were given to do these things are right here in the 10th, 11th, and 12th steps. Let's go back to the basics again. We are powerless over alcohol. This means that we can't not drink. It means that we, on our own unaided will, cannot stop drinking. It means that we are doomed and destined to die of alcoholism. because the disease is incurable. It means that in order for us to be in remission with our disease, we must have God between us and the booze. And we get that by working these steps. This is what's happened now. We put God squarely between us and the booze. Look at the top of page 85. It tells us this, 4 lines down. That's the miracle of it. We're not fighting it, neither are we avoiding temptation. We feel as though we've been placed in a position of neutrality, safe and protected. We have not even sworn off. There's nowhere in the big book tells us don't drink, you know. Not one word that says don't drink. Nowhere does it indicate to us that if we didn't drink today, it was a good day. Nowhere does it indicate to us that the sole purpose of working these steps is to not drink. Quite the contrary, it tells us the purpose of working these steps is to fit ourselves to be of maximum service to God and the people about us. That's our mission, that's our purpose here. So we've not even sworn off. Instead, the problem has been removed and it doesn't exist for us, it's gone. And that tells us the way we're going to be as long as we stay in fit spiritual condition. So in the 10th step, and the 11th step, and the 12th step, we have the tools we need to stay spiritually fit, to stay close to God, and perform His work well. That means then that in the 10th, 11th, and 12th steps, we're looking at those steps which we will use for the rest of our lives to stay close to God and perform His work well, knowing that if we do so, He will give us everything we need. And as our dear friend whose story appeared in the back of the book said, I get everything I need in AA, everything I need I get. And when I get what I need, I find it was just what I wanted all along. Which turns out to be the truth. Right, Peach? You know that. Okay. So now that's a little bit of the background. What are we doing here? All right, the 11th step. Sought through prayer and meditation to what? To improve our conscious contact, which of course means that we have now achieved conscious contact with God, haven't we? Which means that we have now drawn close to Him. To improve our conscious contact with God. Praying only for knowledge of His will for us and the power to carry that out. We have, in the 3rd step, dedicated our lives and our will to Him. And as we have progressed through the steps, we've come to a place of surrender. And now part of our major purpose here is to stay in a state of surrender. The 3rd step prayer has been answered for us. We've been released from the bondage of self. We've had our difficulties removed by God, and therefore we are now examples of His power working in our lives so we can be helpful to other people. So in the 3rd step, in the 10th step, we're going to watch as we go through each day for the things which will come up, these 4 cardinal defects, resentment, dishonesty, selfishness, and fear, because we cannot abide having them in our lives. They block us from God. Go back to the basics again. When we're blocked from God, we're vulnerable to drink. Alcohol is sitting there waiting for us to lose our protection. If we're in God's pocket and we stay there, alcohol can't touch us. And we know that we will never drink again so long as we stay there. Well, now, we must stay close to God and perform His work well. The 10th step teaches us that we will be alienated from God. We will be denied the sunlight of the Spirit if we allow these defects to crop up and don't do something about them. So as we go through the day, we see to it that we use the tools we've been taught. Inventory, admission, submission. That's the 4th, 5th, and 7th steps. And amends, if we need to make amends, the 9th step. We're going to use these tools as we go through the day, and we're going to follow the admonition of the 4th step, which told us that when we get into a real jam, what we do is we turn our thoughts to somebody we can help, that this takes us out of ourselves. And so in the 10th step, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to turn our thoughts resolutely to someone we can help. These are the tools we've already been taught to use. We know that they work because they worked for us as we went through the first 9 steps. This means that as we go through the day, if we're doing our work, if we are conscious of what's going on, if we're self-aware, and if we're willing to take action, we can stay free of the things that block us. Especially, for example, we can stay free of fear. It always bothers me when I hear people talking about the solution to fear being to walk through it. Or in some ways, like outweight it. You wait around long enough, whatever you're afraid of will go away. We have learned already that we don't have to live with fear. As a matter of fact, it would be a shame to live with fear because fear blocks our faith. And fear blocks us from God, and fear is the progenitor and the trigger mechanism for all of our other defects. If I get afraid, you make me afraid, I'm going to get mad at you. I'm never angry with you unless you threaten me in some way. My resentments, my anger come back. What does it tell us in the big book, in the 4th step about anger? That anger is a poison. That if we were to live, we have to stay free of anger. Well, now how do we do that? Some people say, well, anger is quite appropriate in certain circumstances. It's natural. Everybody gets angry now and then. Well, sure they do, but so what? Is there appropriate strychnine? I mean, it's fine for the people who are not under a sentence of death, but it's sure not fine for us. So what happens as we work the 10th step is that we stay free of the things which block us from God during the day. You hear people say you can start your day all over again. You can start your day any time you want. They quote Abraham Lincoln as saying, I reckon a man is about as happy as he wants to be. The question here is, are we willing to do those things necessary to stay free of what will block us from God and keep us from being happy, joyous, and free? Do we want to live today in a reasonable state of serenity and happiness, or are we content to just swallow all that and go around being mad and feeling sorry for ourselves, and then come into the nearest AA room and dump our crap all over the room, saying, well, that's the way I get rid of it. It's not the way we get rid of it. We get rid of it with God's help. These solutions are all spiritual. They don't have anything to do with group therapy. Somebody said yesterday, if I don't open my mouth, I'll open a bottle. And this other thing that's going around these days, I have to rat myself out. God. That's why we have sponsors. That's why we have a close personal contact with a loving God, so that we can take these spiritual solutions we've been taught and use them. Fear, recognized and written down and discussed with another person and turned over to God, equals no fear. This is what we're taught, and this is what works. Look at your 5th step, and you'll find that once having gone through that little formula, it tells us flat out, our fears fall from us. They are gone. We don't have to live in fear. And we sure as hell don't have to listen to the human solutions, which they're fine, except that they come from people who don't have a spiritual solution. So they're telling us the best they know. But we do have a spiritual solution, and we need to use it. This means then, with our 10th step in place and using it, remember the 10th step is a step of inspired genius because it recognizes something that the Oxford people didn't know, that the world and all of its people would continue to threaten us, and we needed to have a way to stay free of those defects which would crop back up, because fear is the trigger for all of those defects. And so we take the steps we've already learned, put them all in one step, we call it the 10th step. And we use those tools and we stay free of the things that block us from God. And any day that we're feeling bad and we want to do something about it, we have the tools to do it. By the way, there's another little axiom that you might pass along to your sponsees. Every time you feel bad, without any exception, there's going to be a fear involved. Therefore, you need to ask yourself, okay, dummy, what are you afraid of now? What's going on here? Let's find out what the threat is. Yes, Sue?
Could you try to fit, talking about fear, you don't talk much about the serenity prayer, far as fear is concerned, I understand, that when it's, when we write about it and we talk about it and we take it to God and ask God to remove it, that our fear is gone. But faith without works is dead. And if we have a fear and it's something based on something in our lives, some circumstances that have to be changed, how do you tie that in with making the necessary changes? Like faith without works is dead. We have to do some work in order to make changes to make the fear go away also.
That's an excellent question. First of all, the Serenity Prayer addresses the fundamental problems of human beings. The first being to be willing to accept all those things we can't change. And unfortunately for us, so much of our grief is centered around trying to change or worrying about or being fearful about things that we can't change, that are going to be there regardless. The courage to change the things we can, well, that's what the steps are about. Because the steps teach us that we're to do those things which we can do. And many of those things require a hell of a lot of courage. Facing ourselves, for example. When you look at chapter 5 and listen to that first paragraph, it tells us that we can't recover if we're not willing to be honest with ourselves. And facing ourselves takes courage. This is not a program for sissies. Sissies don't make it here. It takes courage to work the steps, and those who don't have that courage don't make it. If we're not willing to face ourselves, we can't make it. We need, however, from God, the courage to change the things we can, the courage to face ourselves. That's why in the Serenity Prayer we ask Him for that. And then because we are fallible human beings, and which is not an excuse, it's just a fact, we oftentimes don't know the difference between the things we can't change and the things that require our effort and our courage to change. Because we're capable of doing that, and it's our responsibility to do that. And so we ask God for the wisdom to know the difference between those two things. And when you think about that prayer, it's an incredible prayer. Reinhold Niebuhr, a great theologian, presented that prayer in his church in 1931 in New York City, and eventually it found its way to AA, and we've kind of adopted it. So, but if we're talking about first of all, let's look at the things we can change, Sue. Look at the steps, and you see that what we do in the steps is we find out what didn't work, don't we? None of this stuff worked. And we can see as a result of our inventory and our fifth step and our seventh step and all and as we have analyzed what's happened in our lives, we can see that all of these things that we used to do contributed to our failure, were the things which blocked us from God and contributed substantially to our spiritual bankruptcy. So what we do is we put aside the things that don't work or that didn't work, and we start doing the things that will work. And when we start doing the things that will work, our whole life changes. Now, what is it that works? Well, in general, it is to practice these principles in all of our affairs. In other words, what we find that will work is to take the steps now and put them into every aspect of our lives, because the big book and the 12 steps contain the answer to every human problem. If only we will look for it, we'll find it. So the correlation between the Serenity Prayer and the steps is that the steps do two things for us. First, they show us what we can't change and what didn't work, and then they show us what we can do to change and the things that we can do. And we are, and as a matter of fact, we're put in a place where we must do these things. We must take inventory. We must make admissions. We must pray. We must meditate. We must work with others. All of these actions, we must go each day to God throughout the day and say, "Thy will, not mine, be done." We must take inventory every day as we go through the day. We must take inventory every night before we go to bed. Our prayers and our meditation are all directed to surrender, to find out what God wants us to do and then ask Him to give us the power to do it, not ever asking for ourselves. These are all actions that we take, which the steps direct us to take. And therefore, by doing these things, we are able to have the happiness, joyousness, and freedom. We are able to differentiate, with God's help, between the things that we can't change and the things that we must change, and we must have the power to change, and we have to ask God for that power and that courage. And we get to know the difference. The prayer, the Serenity Prayer, is answered for us. But just like everything else that we do in here, it takes work. We're not going to have all of that just come as a big flash of light because we use that prayer. And when things get tight and we get all jammed up, the Serenity Prayer is a marvelous prayer for that. If there is fear, it's still important, because we're directed to do this in the Big Book, to write the fear down. We got to get it out of our heads. We got to get it down on paper where we can deal with it, and talk to somebody about that fear and ask God to remove it. This is the action that we can take. And the Serenity Prayer will help us to do that. The courage to do the things I can, the courage to change the things I can. That means to take the actions which are necessary. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm thinking more along the lines of the physical actions, like after you do what you're supposed to do to get rid of the fear, you write, you talk, you take it to God, but then you have to physically take some action yourself. You have to, like I was trying to say, faith works is dead. You're explaining the works as being, the thinking, the writing, the talking, the taking to God. I'm thinking of more the physical, changing your behavior day-by-day living.
Oh, yeah. Well, if you found out what didn't work, you stop doing that stuff, right?
Right.
And you start doing the things that will work.
Right.
Absolutely. I thought I made that clear, but maybe not.
You probably did.
When we stop doing the things that don't work and start doing the things that will work, our whole life changes. But what is it that will work? We find out by working the steps. Billy, did you have your hand up?
No.
You did too. You were stretching.
No, this is just the way I casually sit.
Oh, okay. Yes, Peach.
For me, in my experience in dealing with my alcoholism, I thank God for that 10-step, and I know what it means when they say, to thine own self be true, that it's an honest program, that my head would tell me something screwed up to produce guilt and shame and morbid, to get me into that morbid reflection.
Yep.
And that's the kind of honesty that we're talking about here in the program.
Yep.
Because that's the kind of stuff that the disease, it's like, I'm not telling nobody that. That's going down with me to my grave with me. But then when I write it down, I had to do it today. I had to do it before, in my first year of recovery. But I didn't really realize what I was doing. It was like I wasn't working the steps. I was only asking God to keep me straight. I was saying the 3rd step prayer, but I didn't know what the heck I was doing. And then one day I just wrote down this guilty thought that I had in my head, and I was scared to death to go with it to my sponsor with it. And I went and I dumped it. I came into the meeting, and then I heard in the meeting somebody say, this disease will say anything to get you to pick up a drink.
Sure.
And what that is, that that's why it takes the brass balls to go ahead and to cop on that and admit it to somebody who you can trust.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, and now because I did, and I had to do it today. And I would say what it was, but it's on that tape.
No, but it. All we need to know is that it works.
It works.
Okay.
It works. And not only that, but any other situation that I'm concerned about, I write it down because it says, and I'm doing it right now, it says we usually conclude the period of meditation with a prayer that we shown off for the day what our next step is to be, that we be given whatever we need to take care of such problems.
Sure.
Okay, so if I'm doing that in my 10th step, I've got a concern about something in the 10th step, I take it over to the 11th step. I write it down, I ask God, let me be given what I need to take care of this situation. Let me have the courage and the power to carry out your will for me. Because I don't know what your goal for me is in this situation.
Well, you have learned your lessons well, young lady. That's exactly right. I'm glad you shared that. The proof of the pudding is that, what do you got, 6 years now coming up?
I'll be 6 years.
And I'll bet you if anybody was taking bets on you 6 years ago the odds would have been about 90 to 1 against you ever making it past the first year. But you've done it, and you've done it with God's help and because you were willing to follow directions. And I'm real proud of you. That's beautiful. Now then, let's talk about the 11th step and what it is and what it is not. Especially what it is. The 11th step is broken down into 3 parts. Not 2 parts, but 3 parts. The first part of the 11th step is an inventory, which we take every night. And we'll get into that in a few moments. The second part is prayer, and the third part is meditation. And these 3 elements, meditation, inventory, and prayer, are the triumvirate. They are the 3 legs of the 3-legged stool. Bill made one of the few terrifically cogent comments we find in this book about that. Here's what he said. There is a direct linkage among self-examination, which is inventory, meditation, and prayer. Taken separately, these practices can bring much relief and benefit. But when they are logically related and interwoven, the result is an unshakable foundation for life. As we have seen, self-searching is the means by which we bring new vision, action, and grace to bear upon the dark and negative side of our natures. It is a step in the development of that kind of humility that makes it possible for us to receive God's help. And by the way, that refers to what we learned in the 5th step, that we do not learn enough of honesty, humility, and fearlessness until we tell someone else all our life story. Humility is not a function of the 7th step. Honesty is not a function of the 1st step, in spite of all those lists that you see. Humility and honesty are products of the 5th step. And that's what it's saying here, that we do not develop that kind of humility that makes it possible to receive God's help until we have gone through a whole process of self-searching. Now we see why the Big Book tells us that self-honesty is the key. Without self-honesty, we don't recover. Every time we hear chapter 5 being read, we got to listen to that first paragraph. It's telling us the truth. And when we talk about this being an honest program, that's just a catchphrase. The program of the 12 steps requires that we be honest with ourselves. And nowhere is it required that we have cash register honesty. Not in the sense of the 12 steps. In the sense of breaking our own rules of morals and ethics, of course it has a place. But that's right and wrong. And we know right from wrong, most of us, in almost every case. So we don't cheat people, we don't steal from people. To do so places us in jeopardy because we are violating our own codes of morals and ethics. But self-honesty is absolutely necessary in order for us to stay sober, to get sober and to stay sober. Yet it is only a step. We will want to go further. In other words, self-searching is only the first part. We will want the good that is in us all, even the worst of us, to flower and to grow. Most certainly we shall need bracing air and abundance of food. But first of all we shall want sunlight, that sunlight of the Spirit. Nothing much can grow in the dark. Meditation is our step out into the open. How then shall we meditate? So you see, Bill tied inventory, meditation, and prayer together. They constitute the 3 parts of the 11th step. How important is the 11th step? Only life. Huh?
What was the 3 parts again?
inventory, meditation, and prayer. How important is the 11th step? Only life and death. Bill wrote an article called Take the 11th Step, which was published in the Grapevine, I think about 1962 or so, in which he states, and it's something which I absolutely agree with because of my own experience. I've seen this over and over again. The people with long-term sobriety who get into serious trouble with their program and their spirituality and their spiritual fitness, it is always because, at least in part, because they have stopped working the 11th step. When anybody comes to me for help who's been around for a while, the first question I ask them is, you working your 11th step? Invariably the answer is no. Oh, once in a while there'll be a little hedging around, well, as I pray now and then. Well, good. What good is prayer if you don't wait for the answer? Yes.
My name is John. I'm an alcoholic.
Yeah.
My sister just had something very bad happen to her in California, and about 8 months ago, she's amazed that she's been sober 12 years. And I brought her this 11th step, this notion of 11th step and how to do the inventory and stuff. She started doing it for a while, and she would write me emails that says, "This is incredible. I'm so glad you showed me how to do this." She had something very, very bad happen to her recently, an accident with a car. She's all right and everything. But the first thing, I spoke to her and I said, "Well, have you been doing your, do you do your 11th step inventory? Have you been doing it lately?" She goes, "You know what? I haven't been doing it lately." I said, "Start doing it like now and get back doing it." And she called me and said it's the best help that she's had from any of her friends in AA is to do that. Now she's doing it regularly again, and she's spiritually fit, and she feels much better, and she's totally surrendered, and she's looking at this stuff. And for me, when I was told to do it, I went off like a rocket when I started doing my 11th step, really practicing it the way it was shown to me to do it. And I do it still to this day. I have not missed a day, and I've got 887 days sober. The reason I know that is because I do that 11th step inventory.
Mm-hmm. I do something. I put my day of sobriety down right along with the date.
Yeah. And
How many days do you have, Jim?
13,827. But who's counting?
So it works great. I've had nothing but great experience, and I've had sponsees that have been struggling and having a difficult time. They get to this point, and I really show them how to do it, and they actually do what I tell them to do, and their recovery changes 360 degrees.
Right. Well, why am I not surprised? I see that happen constantly. One of the great benefits of this workshop is that most of the people who stick it out and come regularly to it, I've become pretty well convinced that the 11th step is critical, that keeping a journal and answering those questions is critical. And prayer and meditation is the foundation of our conscious contact with God and the growth. You've got to remember that spirituality and spiritual fitness is not something which is the top of a mountain. We've reached a plateau, and now, by George, I think we've got it. It doesn't work that way. We have to do what it takes every day to stay spiritually fit, because spiritual fitness is a function of spiritual growth. We don't stay spiritually fit by standing still. Think of it as an escalator which is coming down, and you're carrying a 50-pound pack, and you got to get up here, and you got to walk up that down escalator. And so that means you got to be walking faster than the escalator is coming down. You stand still, you're right back to the bottom again. And this is the way that we each have to do it. The Big Book says that we're undisciplined, and we have to let God discipline us this way. And it requires an act of will. It requires of us that we make ourselves do it at first. And as John is just telling us, shared with us, once we get so we're doing it for a while, and Peach knows this too, and Sue, a lot of you people know it, you wouldn't be without it. because everything changes so beautifully. Matter of fact, a lot of times, if you're doing a lot of sponsorship and people come to you who've been around for quite a while and they've had a little slip, they'll come and say, "What should I do?" I talked to X, Y, and Z, and A, B, and C, and all 6 of them said I had to go back to the first step. And I usually say to them, "That's nonsense. Start working your 10th, 11th, and 12th steps again. You'll straighten right out." And almost always they do. I'm not talking about somebody who was here for 3 months and then relapsed. But people who have been around long enough that there's no doubt they took the first step and the second step, probably the third step. And now they're being told they're going to have to go back and do this all again and do another 4th step, another 5th step. Well, if we do a 10th and 11th step and we do it every day, we never have to do another 4th step. We never have to do another 5th step because nothing ever gets ahead of us. What are you going to do? Sit down and write stuff out that you've already taken care of? That would be silly. So one of the things that we're going to do now as we work our 11th step is we're going to follow the principle, and it is a principle, that we must get everything that's going on with us out of our heads and get it down on paper. Remember in the 4th step we learned that an inventory is a written list. Why would you try to take inventory in your head? Why would you do that any more than you would try to take inventory of your shoe store or your ribbons store or anything else where you had to count inventory? You wouldn't do that. You'd know that half of it's going to fall through the cracks somewhere. So we write it down. The other thing about writing it down is this. When we have things going on in our minds are so convoluted and so complex that there are all kinds of thoughts in collision with each other. And we don't get any resolution of this stuff. But the moment that we write it down, we make it real. Now it's on paper. We've gotten it out of our heads and down on paper. And now we can handle it. It's no longer a part of the mishmash up here. It's down here in black and white. Now we can deal with it. Yes, Peach.
It tells us in the 11th step, it works if we have the proper attitude toward it.
Yes.
Big key right there to applying ourselves with the willingness to do this. And I'm new at trying to help people with this. I just know that what you taught me, you told me if I do my part, God does his part. But somebody, which I was concerned, someone who does not have the right attitude to work at this rightly, I'm wondering, does that have something to do with the first step? If this person was grounded in the first step, because it says to carry this message, it must have depth and weight to hold these people, which can interest them and hold them.
Yeah.
So,
that's the message, though, not the first step.
So I was wondering if the attitude isn't right, is it that there's a reservation? Is it that, how do we work on this as far as that goes?
What is the promise? That our whole attitude and outlook upon life will change.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay?
Right.
The light dawns. Okay. Now then, at the bottom of page 85, it tells us that step 11 suggests prayer and meditation. We shouldn't be shy on this matter of prayer. Better men than we are using it constantly. It works if we have the proper attitude and work at it. It would be easy to be vague about this matter, yet we believe we make some definite and valuable suggestions. Now then, this next paragraph is one which is either misunderstood or ignored a good part of the time. So now let's see what we're really looking at here. This next paragraph on page 86 is the 11th step inventory. It consists of 10 questions which need to be answered every night in writing. Now I know it doesn't say to write. One of the advantages of doing this work properly is that we look up any words we don't understand. The word inventory is defined as a written list. We're going to review our day. Review is just another way of saying inventory our day. Now you may think that this is going a little bit far and it's not necessary to do this, and there are some who feel that way. I have to tell you that they don't have anywhere near the kind of serenity and happiness they ought to have, because they're dealing with stuff here that they never really resolve. But when we get it down on paper, we will do what's necessary to resolve it. There are then 10 questions, and the first 4 questions deal with the cardinal defects: selfishness, resentment, dishonesty, and fear. Look back on page 84 again. Let's just make sure we're all on the same page here. Down on page 84, the middle paragraph, right in the middle of that paragraph, we find the 10th step. Continue to watch for selfishness, dishonesty, resentment, and fear. Those 4 things. When we do our 4th step and we do our 5th step, those are the defects of character that we find in our 4th step and admit in our 5th step. There may be all kinds of other stuff that we don't like about ourselves, quirks of character and so forth, but those 4 are the 4 defects which the 4th step is designed specifically to uncover. Notice that here in the 11th step, we're dealing with highly spiritual matters, and yet not once does this big book mention anything about sin, 7, deadly, or any other kind of sin. Because this is not a religion, and we don't deal with sin here. If you want to use that, and because your religious beliefs demand it, that's fine. That's not AA. What we deal with are these defects of character, which are in fact the result of fear operating on our natural God-given instincts for sex, security, and society. So our first 4 questions are designed for us to see if during this past day were we resentful, selfish, dishonest, or afraid. Now, a good practice, if we answer yes, I was resentful, we need to write down what the circumstances were. Whom did we resent, and what did they do that harmed us? That's the 4th step, translated into the 11th step. See how that works? Everything we've learned, all the tools that we've been taught, are now back right here for us to use. Also, keep in mind that what we're doing here is looking back during the day. Did I have a resentment crop up that I didn't deal with? I'm going to check up on myself here to see if my staying self-aware is actually working. Yes, Sue?
Yeah, it may sound kind of silly, but if we already took care of it during the day in our 10th step, we don't have to redo it again in the 11th step.
Of course not. We can say yes, but I took care of it in the 10th step. The next question is the 9th step. Do I owe an apology? What does the 10th step say? When we were wrong, we promptly admitted it. So now we're going back and checking up on ourselves during the day to see if we hurt somebody and we didn't make amends. Do I owe an apology? The next question, have I kept something to myself which should be discussed with another person at once? That's the 5th step. In other words, have I admitted what's gone wrong with me during the day? I'm looking back now to see if during the day I got off the path. Now, there's a very specific reason for this, and I'm going to show it to you in a minute. Was I kind and loving toward all? Remember, in the 10th step we learned that love and tolerance of others is our code. A code is an unbreakable rule. It's not negotiable. Now at night I'm looking back to see, did I practice love and tolerance? Was I in fact loving toward others and tolerant of them? We must never forget that all the way back into the most ancient of written history, we find the same principles expressed in one way or another. For example, in the book of Micah, Micah was a minor prophet. And Micah was asked by the people, what does God expect of us? They thought he was going to say to sacrifice 10,000 lambs and 1,600 skins of oil. what he said was, God expects of us that we be just, that we be merciful, and that we walk humbly with our God. That's what God expects of us. Translate that here to the 11th step. Was I just? Was I merciful? Did I walk humbly with God? Next question. During this day which just passed, what could I have done better? Very important question, isn't it? Because it means it was necessary for us now to be self-aware enough and self-honest enough to recognize the weaknesses perhaps in the way we lived our lives today. Did I leave something undone which I should have done? Did I do things I should not have done? I'm going to write that down. I'm looking here to improve my conscious contact with God. I'm looking here to improve in my spiritual fitness by improving my spirituality. And in order to do that, I've got to be willing to see the things that I need to change. Was I thinking of myself most of the time? This is deadly stuff. Remember what we learned back in the third step, that our troubles of our own making, that alcoholics are extreme example of self-will run riot, but we usually don't think so. We learned that we had to be free of this selfishness. We had to, or it'd kill us. Why? Because when our heads are full of self, there's no room for God. We want to have the Spirit in us so that we're protected, so that our problem is solved. And yet when we're dealing entirely with self and selfishness and self-centeredness and self-centered fear and self-delusion, self-pity, we've literally blocked God out. So it's critical for us to look in our 11th step to see if today I was thinking of myself most of the time. Was I spending my day in a self-centered way, especially with self-centered fear and self-seeking, where I was out to get all that I could get, regardless of who might be hurt by that? And then the final question, or was I thinking of what I could do for others, of what I could pack into the stream of life? Now that's a wonderful question to answer in the affirmative, because when we can look back on our day and we can see that our thoughts were turned to be helpful to others, that we in fact practiced a kind of humility which led us to be willing to do God's work, to carry His message, to be of maximum service to God and the people about us. This is our mission. This is what we're required to do by virtue of God's having granted us this sobriety and granted us His power. We've granted God's power so, as the 12th step says, we can carry this message to other alcoholics. And so we look to see, and we get to answer joyfully, yes, I really, looking what I could pack into the stream of life. Instead of being a taker, I've now become a giver. Then it goes on to tell us that we must be careful not to drift into worry, remorse, or morbid reflection. Not so that we'll be happy, joyous, and free, or healthy, wealthy, and wise. Not so we will be able to sleep well tonight. Not so we'll have a good shot at getting that house on the bay or that 50-foot Matthews. For that would diminish our usefulness to others. Every message in this big book is consistent with every other message. And all along the way, as we are imbued with God's power and His grace and His mercies and His miracles, it is so that we can be of maximum service to Him and the people about us. Remember that the rule is stated so succinctly on page 77. It tells us this, that at the moment we're trying to set our lives in order, but this is not an end in itself. Our real purpose is to fit ourselves, to be of maximum service to God and the people about us. And here again, don't drift into worry, remorse, and morbid reflection, because this would diminish our usefulness to others. See how consistent the book is? It never varies. You won't find an inconsistency anywhere. And I've never seen any writing anywhere that you could say that about except this book. It doesn't mean that I have exhausted the Metropolitan Library in New York either, but I've read quite extensively. I've never seen anything like this. Now then, we come to the bottom line of all of this. Why are we doing this? Why did we go through all of this trouble to take this inventory? After making our review, we ask God's forgiveness and inquire what corrective measures should be taken. Now we know where this comes from because we already worked our fourth step. Go back to page 70, please. See, we already learned this. But now we got to make the correlation in order to understand what this 11th step is doing. Top of page 70, first full paragraph, 5 lines down from the top. Suppose we fall short of the chosen ideal and stumble. What is our ideal for the way we live our lives? The big book tells us that the spiritual life is not a theory, we have to live it. What's the 12 steps say? Practice these principles in all of our affairs. On page 85 it tells us that every day is the day when we must carry a vision of God's will for us into all our activities, and that we must constantly go through a process of surrender, saying, "Thy will, not mine, be done." Now, have we done that? Have we fallen short? Well, what's going to happen? Go back to page 70. Does this mean we're going to get drunk? Some people tell us so, but this is only a half-truth. It depends on us and on our motives. Now, here's the rule. If we are sorry for what we have done and have the honest desire to let God take us to better things, we believe we will be forgiven and will have learned our lesson. So now we have looked back at our day to see if we have stepped off the path. Now if you see that, now you begin to understand why you have to do this. Going on. If we are not sorry and our conduct continues to harm others, we're quite sure to drink. We're not theorizing. These are facts out of our experience. And people who don't do this are in grave danger of drinking. This is one of the reasons that we immediately get them back on their 11th step. So after making our review, we ask God's forgiveness and show our willingness to be taken on to better things by inquiring what corrective measures should be taken. You see how this all works together? Everything in this big book, everything in the steps fits together just like a fine Swiss watch. There isn't any wasted space. Everything is very compact, very dense. This is the only place in the big book where we are instructed, directed to ask forgiveness. Why would we go past that? Why would we try to say this doesn't have anything to do with the 11th step? And a lot of people say that. It's just something kind of nice to look over maybe once in a while, see how you're doing. This inventory has a very specific purpose. We need to constantly check ourselves to see if we're staying on the path. And when we get off, we seek God's help and we ask Him to help us do better tomorrow. And we demonstrate the fact that we're sorry for what we've done, our regret. And when we do this, what happens is that we retain our humility, without which we don't have a prayer. We have learned once again, and we repeat this lesson every day, being self-honest, dealing with ourselves and our lives in a strictly honest way, not indulging ever in self-delusion, ever again. One of the things that happens here is that we put aside all the excuses for our crapped out behavior that everybody with the spiritual, with the human solution keeps feeding us. What difference does it make if you had a dysfunctional family? What's that got to do with the bad choices you've been making? What's that got to do with the fact that there is a solution which does not have anything whatsoever to do with your family? has only to do with you and your relationship with God. What does a dysfunctional family have to do with the fact that we're spiritually bankrupt when we get here? What's it got to do with the fact that once the spiritual malady is overcome, we will straighten out mentally and physically? Another great promise in the Big Book. It's interesting, supposedly, but it's a so what? Because you see, what's happening here is that people with human solutions have got it all figured out that if we just find out why we drank, we'll quit drinking. And yet self-knowledge never got anybody sober. Look at what happened to Roland H. Roland went over to Europe and spent a year with Dr. Jung, one of the foremost psychiatrists, one of the leaders of the new psychiatric movements, he and Freud and Adler. And Jung spent a year tearing Roland Hazard apart, piece by piece, so that his entire psyche lay on the floor, disassembled. And now he helped him put it back together into this new man. And Roland had all this knowledge about exactly what was going on with him, and why this and why that and why this and why that, and what had happened to him here and what happened to him there, and why he felt the way he did. And obviously these were the answers to why he drank. And when he came back from Europe and he came back to the United States, he was sure he'd never drink again because he had all this knowledge about himself. Within a few weeks he was drunk again. And he went back to see Dr. Jung. He went back to Europe and he said, I don't understand. I went through all of this and in a few weeks I was drunk again. And Dr. Jung said, well, I guess I'm going to have to admit to you that you're one of those chronic alcoholics for which we can do nothing. And absent a complete psychic change, absent a spiritual awakening of some kind, you are doomed to death. I cannot help you. We find this again, it's expressed most clearly in chapter 3, the stories of Jim and Fred. Reread those. In both cases, Jim and Fred had great knowledge about themselves. And Fred even went so far as to declare that now that I know all this stuff, and now I know what's the matter with me, and I'll never drink again. He began to drink as casually as if it was breathing, as if he was ordering dessert. Same with Jim. Self-knowledge doesn't keep us sober. And all of the stuff that we're taught that has something to do with psychological principles is wonderful stuff. I'm sure it's quite scientific, and it probably works very well for people who are not under a sentence of death, whose minds are not controlled by a disease which lies to them constantly, who have not had a history of escaping from their fears by the use of alcohol or drugs. Those other people may do quite well on it. The fact is that we don't. We don't do any better on that than we do on religion. And that's another very interesting fact, because it would seem that somehow or another, if we're practicing a spiritual program, anybody who had strong religious convictions would just simply stay sober. Doesn't work that way. These are spiritual principles. These are God's spiritual principles. There's no doubt about that. But nowhere here does it say, thou shalt not. It says, thou shalt. See what's happened? These great spiritual principles have been restated as steps of action. And nowhere do we find these in any literature anywhere prior to 1938. They're steps of action, which means that if we take the action, we incorporate these great spiritual principles into our very being. They become a part of us. They become the way we live our lives. And when we do that, we nestle very securely in God's arms. And we never drink again so long as we stay there. And no matter what the problems are that may come in life, and they are manifold, and some of them very severe, and a lot of times we don't have any idea how they're going to come out, how we're going to be able to somehow manage to deal with them. But it's so strange, because The moment that we learn the very, very basic lesson, that we do what's in front of us to be done today, we do the next right thing as it presents itself. We do nothing to harm another person. We carry this message wherever we can, and we leave the results up to God. And when we do that, lo and behold, somehow or another, it works out. And we don't have any idea where it's coming from. And yet it's there. And there are many, many people in here who have experienced this over and over and over again. I know I certainly have. Sometimes it's real simple things, and other times it's of enormous importance. But nevertheless, God's promise to give us everything we need if we stay close to Him and perform His work well is an absolute. And it always works that way. Yes, Peach?
Thank you, Jim, for bringing that up. I'm really glad that you did. Could you please give me a 12 and 12, please? One of the things from my experience, basically from the Pompano Beach group, is that, the disease is in the rooms too, as well. And a lot of people go around spreading the disease as well as they do of recovery. But it goes in here and it says, well, we might next ask ourselves, what kinds of harms do people do to another anyway? Okay, to define the word harm in a practical way, we might call it the result of instincts in collision, which cause physical, mental, emotional, or spiritual damage to people. If our tempers are consistently bad, we arouse others in anger. If we lie or cheat, we deprive others not only of their worldly goods, but of their emotional security and peace of mind. We really issue them an invitation to become contemptuous and vengeful. If our sex conduct is selfish, we may excite jealousy, misery, and a strong desire to retaliate in kind. And it says such gross misbehavior is not by any means a full catalog of the harms we do. Other ones are irritability, irresponsible, callous, cold, critical, impatient, humorlessness, lavishing attention upon one member of the family and neglecting others, trying to dominate the whole family in general, ruled by an iron by constant outpouring of minute direction of just how their life should be lived from 1 hour to 1 hour. What happens when we wallow in depression, self-pity oozing from every pore and inflict that upon us? Such a roost of harms done others, the kind that make daily living with us as non-practicing alcoholics, difficult and often unbearable, could be extended almost indefinitely. When we take such personality traits as these into shop, office, and the society, which Alcoholics Anonymous is a society of our fellows, they can do damage almost as extensive as that we have caused at home. And that is the kind of harms that we need to be looking to in the rooms, because how many times I have gone through that by people saying to me, Peach, where are you living? And and like you said, God, if we stay close to God, God provides for those. And it's the people that are going around the gossip, telling all these lies, about God's handiwork, making God's handiwork look disgusting or something.
Well, that's right. But one of the most important tasks you have as a sponsor is to see to it that your sponsees understand that, and that you do not condone it in any way, and you don't permit them to do it. If I can't stop a sponsee of mine from doing that kind of stuff, I tell them go fish somewhere. I have nothing more to do with it. Remember, there's only one unforgivable sin in AA, and that's to interfere with the recovery of another person. And the unity of our fellowship is absolutely crucial to our personal recovery. And anything that splits up the unity of the fellowship or the group, which makes people choose sides, which is going on right now, it's inimical not only to the sobriety of the person picked on, but the sobriety of everybody in the group. So there's any doubt about these things are serious and they need to be addressed. But most importantly, we need, as sponsors, to carry this message. That ultimately the only way that any of this works out is that one person walking on a spiritual path with another person both growing spiritually together. That's what sponsorship is. Carries this message, and that way we spread the message out. That's why we do this workshop, because out of every workshop a few people emerge who really go out there and carry the message from the big book, the message of the steps. And so it spreads out, and it keeps on spreading. Carry that message. Peach, you've learned it. Now you carry it. Okay, we need to pay the rent here, guys.
Thanks for letting me get down.
We have any announcements for the good of AA?
It's good.
There's a dance tonight at the 101 at 10 o'clock. We have live entertainment, food, professional DJ. It'll be a lot of fun. It's a whoopee party, yeah. Here you go, Tommy. All right, now we have these chips here. Anybody who's been out improving their resume just coming back? Anybody been doing further research and found out it's not any better out there? Okay, we have anyone who wants to pick up a white chip for any reason? Okay. How about 3 months or 6 months or 9 months? Anybody ready for one of those chips? Anybody have an AA birthday in the month of February? Okay, take care of that. And are any other announcements for the good of AA?
It's good.
Okay. All right. Next week, then, we will complete our discussion of the 11th step. And by the way, when you come, please be prepared, because we will pray and meditate together for a while. It's very important for us to be able to see just how powerful group meditation can be when it's done right. And we'll talk about meditation, what it is in AA, and we'll kind of set it apart from ashrams and crystals and incense and gongs and people in saffron robes and all that stuff. Because it's a very simple but very effective way to contact God and stay in contact with Him, and we'll get a chance to look at that next week. Anybody with an irresistible impulse, otherwise known as a burning desire? All right, let's close the meeting.
Hey, did you know I had a birthday?
Huh?
You know I had a birthday since last time I talked to you.
Birthday of what? Let this circle represent the unity of our fellowship as our moment of silence for those who are still suffering. And we'll say the Lord's Prayer together. Thank you. Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Thank you all so much for being here. And by the way, if you ever want any tapes or CDs of these made in C. Tommy, he's got everything there for you. That's our secret agent girl. She's not wearing her secret agent hat and her raincoat today, but she's usually sneaking around here like some kind of a spook.